Hi everyone, BritSimon here. So I wanted to try and explain a little bit more about the UK number selection. People are not really understanding. They're not picking up what I'm putting down, as they would say in America. If I feel like I need to give a little bit more of a clear explanation about what has happened, because I'm still getting questions from people that think the government will kind of change the numbers that they've selected later, that the case numbers will somehow get reorganized, etc., to be more sensible, and that isn't what's going to happen, right? And so I wanted to explain what has happened, and explain also some of the theory about how the draw process works. Now, some of you are going to find this interesting. It will answer some questions for you, particularly UK winners, who are wondering why you've got case numbers of 130,000, 150,000, 180,000, or whatever. It's going to answer questions for some of you that don't necessarily understand the draw process. The video also might be helpful for anybody that wants to understand the draw process and how it works for any of the regions in any normal year. And it might actually be helpful if some of the government employees want to watch it, so that you can understand how the damn system works, and perhaps you would do better in the future. But anyway, so let me see if I can sort of explain this. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some official information that's published by the government on entry numbers, and I'm picking a past year. I'm picking DV2019. There's a couple of reasons why I'm picking that particular year. It was what I think of as the last sort of more or less sensible year. It's obviously immediately before COVID hit us and that sort of thing. And there were some other changes that were made, so DV19 is kind of an interesting year to pick. In terms of data to look at, one of the reports that the government publish, and they're very behind in publishing this data, but one of the reports they publish is the number of entries received during each registration period by region and country of chargeability, right? The last data that we have is published in 3-year chunks, and the last data we have is DV 2019 to 2021. So that's DV 2019, 2020, and 2021. So in this table that we're seeing here, you can see that the region is designated, and then the country is designated, and then there are 3 columns for each of the 3 years. So there's the number of entrants in each year, the number of derivatives on those on the entries that is mentioned in the first column, and then the total number of people, therefore, that have entered from that country during this year, and also the region that they're in, right? Now, the number of entries is important because if you understand a little bit about the process, you'll know that the draw process is regional, and it is also a random draw process. But some of you may not understand how the draw actually works, and I'm going to explain that. So that could be sort of interesting to you. But one important point I made there was that the draw is regional, not by country. Some of you think the draw is organized by country, and that this country, France, is given a certain number of selectees, and Germany is given a certain number of selectees, and Uzbekistan is given a certain number of selectees, and because they consistently, year after year, get roughly those sort of number of selectees, that's how it works. But that isn't how it works. The number of selectees that are given to each country each year is entirely dependent on the number of entries for that country within the region as a whole. And I'll explain exactly what I mean by that. Okay. So if we go down to Europe, and I'm going to use Europe for this data because obviously we're talking about Europe and we're talking about the UK entry, so it's probably best to use Europe. And as I mentioned, I'm gonna use 2019 entry data, but we'll briefly look at the 2020 and 2021 entry data as well. So if we look at this line here, this is Europe, the total for Europe as a whole. And let me just check that I'm making this big enough. Maybe I can make that a tad bigger. Yeah, that can be a little bit bigger and it'll be a little bit easier on your eyes. Okay, so the total for Europe there, the number of entrants in DV 2019 was 4.35 million, basically 4,349,555 entries, right? On those entries, on that 4.35 million entries, there were 3.27 million derivatives. What are the derivatives? They are the spouses and the children of the main entry. So every entry is individual entry, and the spouse and the children get added. And in aggregate, that's 7.6 million people that were on these entries. But of course, your chance of winning a lottery, if you imagine buying a lottery ticket, your chance of winning the lottery is dependent on the number of entries, not the number of people in your family that you're going to share the money with, right? And in the same way, the DV lottery, the chance of your selection is actually to do with the entries and not the people. Okay, so here we have DV 2019 data. There was a total of 7.6 million people on 4.35 million entries. If we look at 2020, these three columns here, there were 4 million entries, a little bit less entries, 3.1 million derivatives, for a total of nearly 7.2 million. And then in DV 2021, now DV 2021 entry period happened towards the end of 2019. It wasn't affected by COVID yet, but it was affected by the passport rule. The passport rule was introduced in 2019, and so the number of entries went down significantly. The government don't seem to understand that because they want to implement the passport rule again at some point, and they also want to implement a $1 fee, which I think they will implement in the next lottery. But they don't seem to understand that the impact of those sort of changes that they make actually reduces the number of selectees. They also don't seem to understand that the number of selectees is not the same as the number of entries, right? So, anyway, God bless them at the government. They're a little bit slow to learn. So roughly speaking, the number of entries in DV 2021 halved for Europe. There was only just over 2 million entries, and there was almost the same number, 1.9 million derivatives on those cases. That in itself, by the way, is an interesting sort of data point for me. The fact is, when the passport rule was introduced, there were all of a sudden there were less entries, yes, but now there's roughly a one-to-one relationship between the number of entries and the number of derivatives. Previously, 4.35 million people only had 3.2 million derivatives, which means the marriage rate in DV 2019, the marriage and child rate was significantly lower than it was in DV 2021. Had patterns changed in those 2 years, or was the passport rule actually a factor that meant slightly different numbers of entries were made by various countries, and was there less fraud leading to different derivative rates, etc. So, and that's probably what was going on. You can also see some other sort of fairly startling things here, like, Uzbekistan, bless them. If you're from Uzbekistan, I'm sorry, I'm going to sort of pick on your country a little bit. Uzbekistan's population is about 36 million people. In DV 2019, 1.8 million people, accounting for 2.8 million of the population, so pretty close to 10% of the population, all thought it was a good idea to enter the lottery. The DV lottery, right? When the passport rule was introduced in DV 2021, that number dropped significantly. It was actually, 1.8 million entries drops to 466,000 entries. So it dropped by, 75% decrease down to 466,000. I wonder why that is. Perhaps that's perhaps that's something to do with the fraud that was going on in that country up until that point, right? And so there was a massive decrease. Although the region as a whole decreased by half, that particular country decreased by 75%. You can see slightly similar thing in Ukraine. Ukraine had a decrease from 665,000 entries in DV 2019 down to 210,000. So we can see some information by looking at this data, and I've studied this data in the past. It's kind of interesting to geeks such as myself. But what I've done is I've taken the DV 2019 data from this spreadsheet and I've plotted it into another spreadsheet. And I'm going to show you and explain how the draw would then work based on these numbers. Now, 4.35 million is the number of entries in this year. So Uzbekistan had 1.813357, 1.8 million entries out of the 4.3 million, right? Huge number in Uzbekistan alone. And Ukraine accounted for a massive number of those entries as well, right? So if we look at a spreadsheet here and we have a look at some of the countries, I've chosen to pick out some of the countries in that list there. And I've chosen to sort of highlight some of these countries so I can explain, what that means. So there's the 1.8 million entries from Uzbekistan. Armenia had 102,000 entries, right? France had 34,000 entries and Germany had 45,000 entries, okay? So you would expect in that scenario, you would expect to see winners that went in line with those numbers, those ratios, right? And it does, but there is a little bit of a complication to that, right? So I'm going to explain that a little bit. First of all, you can see the derivative rate per country is quite different, right? 2.43 people per entry in Armenia versus 1.7 people per entry in France, right? The family rate, the derivative rate is lower in France than it is in Armenia for whatever reason. It was extremely low in Uzbekistan in DV 2019, only 1.57. And I can tell you that by the time those winners actually come to interview, those numbers are far higher. People get married when they win the lottery. Babies are born, of course. I'm not suggesting that babies are born because someone won the lottery, but people do get married because they won the lottery, etc. And so there is some impact of winning the lottery to these numbers, okay? But these derivative rates are what I tend to call the starting derivative rates. And these are actually very early. These are the entry derivative rates. The derivative rate will increase and mature as we go through the process, and you can see that in the data every year. But that's not really my main point. I just wanted to explain that as an aside. Okay, so if Uzbekistan has 1.8 million entries out of 4.349 million entries, then they have got 41.69% of all the entries, right? So in that scenario, if the draw process is a random sort of shuffling of the draw of all the entries, then essentially what happens is that 4.35 million entries are all sort of randomized in terms of the order, and then ordered from number 1 down to number 4,349,000 and so on, right? Literally every single case will be ordered in order, in a random order. And that's actually the main part of the draw process. The first part of the draw process is to assign a case number to every single entry, whether they're qualified to be in the draw or not. It's not important. Whether their photo is good or not, it's not important yet. All of those entries that are in the draw process, including every mistaken entry, every fraudulent entry, every bad photo entry, and so on, they're all included in that numbering process from 1 to 4.35 million, right, in DV 2019. Now, 41.69% of every single 41.69% of every entry was someone chargeable to Uzbekistan. So it's logical to assume that if the randomization process is truly random, that there will be a fairly uniform distribution. Now, it's not going to be a precisely uniform distribution, but pretty uniform distribution. So then we can assume that in every 1,000 cases, 416, nearly 417 of those 1,000 cases would be Uzbekistan chargeable cases, right? That's the first principle I'd like you to grasp, that distribution is, because it's random, it tends to sort of, depending on what sort of slice of data you take, whether it's 1,000 cases or 100 cases and so on, it tends to get to the point where the distribution is more or less uniform. In other words, in the first half of the draw, the first 2 million entries, there would be roughly half of the Uzbekistan entries are in the first half, and in the second half there would be another, the other half, right? And so then if you break those two halves down still further, down to 1 million entries and 100,000 entries, and ultimately a number like 1,000 entries, you can begin to assume how many entries from any specific country should be in that 1,000 case numbers, right? So you can do the same thing for the other countries. You can say, okay, Germany has 1.06% of the entries. Therefore, in every 1,000 cases, you should have 10.6 German winners, right? And there are 0.78% French entries throughout the whole 4.35 million number of entries. So there should be 7.8 winners per 1,000 case numbers throughout the whole number range, right? Now, of course, I'm not saying that there are 7.8 winners or winning entries in every 1,000 cases. This is a distribution, a statistical distribution, which means that there'll be 8 or 9 cases in the first 1,000, and then maybe there'll be 5 cases in the second 1,000, and so on. So you have to zoom out a little bit to get to the point where the number is more of a uniform distribution, but it serves our purposes anyway. It explains the process reasonably well, right? 2.3%, 2.36% would be Armenians, right? Now, if there's 2.36% Armenians, there should be roughly 3 times more Armenian winners than there are French winners, right? And there should be roughly, looks like about twice as many Armenian winners as there were for the German winners, and so on, right? We should be able to look at it that way, because if your chance is truly random by every country, then that's what's going to happen. The number of winners that the country gets is directly related to the number of entries it had in the original draw. So I took the number of winners, okay, and said, okay, how many winners are there from each of these countries, and then used the derivative rate to see how many winning entries there were from each of those countries. So this is the number of winners, right? 366 and 488. So there's a pretty good correlation between France and Germany, because they're two very similar countries with relatively similar derivative rates. And there's a correct relationship between the two numbers there for France and Germany. At first glance, Armenia looks a little bit higher, but of course their derivative rate is higher. So their 1,738 winners means a winning case number of 700, or winning cases, 715 winning cases, if you calculate using the derivative rate, versus 215 winning cases for France, and that's more appropriate in terms of the ratio that you would expect between these numbers of entries: 102,000 for Armenia and 34,000 for France. So roughly speaking, you would expect Armenia to get roughly 3 times as many, just over 3 times as many winning entries as France, and that's exactly what they've got. Now you can then see the winning percentage chance, and these start to look a little bit more sensible. 0.7% winning percentage chance for every entry in Armenia, 0.63 percentage winning chance for every entry in France, 0.58 for every entry in Germany, and so on, right? Now, then Uzbekistan falls off a cliff. What's going on there, right? Why is there only a 0.12% chance of winning in Uzbekistan? Let me come to that in a moment. I'll explain that in a moment. But I want to point out, some more of this data, right? Now, these numbers here came from the visa bulletin that was published in, it would have been published in September of 2018 for DV 2019, right? So we can go and get those numbers. And again, it's part of the data that the government provides every year, right? Well, they normally do. They haven't provided the data this year because of my lawsuit, frankly, but it's now clear to me that it's because of the lawsuit. But I'm hoping that we'll get that data shortly on DV26. We do have it for DV25, and it basically is the number of winners per country. Okay, so let's talk about Uzbekistan. So Uzbekistan is a country, as I mentioned, of 36 million people, and 1.8 million of those people decided to enter the lottery, and that covers nearly 3 million people in that country. So almost 10% of the country entered the lottery. That's bizarre number of entries, right? It's well understood, therefore, that actually quite a lot of those entries are probably affected by fraudulent entries of some sort. There must be agents or organizations who are somehow pushing people, encouraging people to enter the lottery in Uzbekistan, perhaps in numbers that don't really make sense. Right now, exactly how that's happening, I don't know. There have been cases in the past. There was a case many years ago in Bangladesh where the US government figured out that some wise guy had taken basically a phone book and had registered many people from the phone book in Bangladesh, hoping that when those people won, he would then be able to contact those people and say, hey, you're a winner in the green card lottery. If you give me $1,000 or $2,000 or whatever he wanted, I'll give you the winning details, right? He had proactively registered people in the lottery that didn't know anything about it. And so that fraud was discovered and, action was taken. But there are other sort of, types of activities that go on that may be fraudulent or maybe not fraudulent, maybe just well organized agencies who are sort of collecting people's data to actually enter them into the lottery, and it's all above board, it's all legitimate. Maybe that goes on too. I don't know. I'm not really trying to make a comment about that. I'm just trying to explain that there are many entries from Uzbekistan which then get weeded out through fraud detection processes. But there's also something else that goes on. There's something during the draw process which I've always described as a limiting process. Now, if 417 people were Uzbekistan winning cases from every 1,000 entries, with the number of derivatives, we would get to, if I bring up a calculator, we would get to, let me just bring up a calculator here. We would get to the number of entries very quickly, right? So let's say there's 417 people. Actually, let me do it the other way around. There's 2,205 winning cases in Uzbekistan in DV 2019. If we divide that by the number of cases per 1,000, which is 417, that gives us 5.28 thousands before we have got to the end of that process, right? Now, if we look at the data for a second, let me just show you the DV 2019 data, and we take a look at what I call the shape of the data or the look of the data. This is how the data actually looked. We had case numbers up to 31,000 that went current. At this time, the data was just being taken and was shown up until that. I think that year did go current. And you can see that the number of cases, this blue color represents holes, gaps in the process. Now, those holes are created when individual cases are disqualified before the announcement of the results, right? And that is for things like the bad photos or for fraudulent entries, mistakes in the entry, and that sort of thing. The government goes through that or every case, and they weed out a bunch of cases. And so in DV 2019, remember this is a few years ago, they didn't have so much AI, power to go through photos and that sort of thing. But even in those days, they were able to figure out that almost 40% of the cases were disqualified before the results were announced, right? So that's what that blue color is. It's cases that are made into holes. We call them holes. And it's gaps between the numbers, right? So the 60% number, though, continues, right? So we've got almost just over 60% until case number, a number between case number 10,000 and 11,000. And then the number of winners kind of falls off a cliff, right? And I describe that as we hit a cliff. And so actually that tells me that Uzbekistan ran out of winners. Their 3,400 selectees all had case numbers under 10,000. The limit is then applied. The government say, hey, we've got enough winners from Uzbekistan. There's no need for us to take any more. And so they impose an artificial limit. And from that point forward, any Uzbekistan case gets disqualified, right? Well, that dramatically changes the winning chances for entries from Uzbekistan, right? And so if we go back to our spreadsheet a moment, we then begin to understand that with the fraudulent case detection and the artificial limit that is in place by the government, that's why the winners from Uzbekistan, although they have a lot of winners, they don't have as many winners as they should do. They only have 0.12% of their entries are actually winners, right? And they only have 2,200 winning cases, and their case numbers stopped in that year at 10,000 something, right? So roughly a third of the way through. That's an artificial limit being placed on that country. Ukraine in that year also had an artificial limit placed on them, but a slightly different point in the chart. Which is why you see a second cliff that appears in that year. Now, that's continuing today. If we look at the EU data for this last year, DV 2025, the Uzbekistan cliff was hit at about case number 15,500, I think it was. And so that's the drop off there. And then later we had the Ukraine cliff, and that caused another drop in numbers there. Okay. So a very high number of entries from a particular country will get them extra winners, yes, but they will also be potentially limited during the draw. Now, I'm not suggesting that's happened at all to the UK. That's not what I think has happened to the UK, because I don't expect the UK has many entries, frankly, in DV26 or DV25. But it's a useful thing to understand, and it illustrates how the draw process works, and it sort of fills in the gaps for some people who perhaps don't understand all of the ins and outs, right? So if we know the number of entries per 1,000, or the number of the percentage number of cases, number of entries, you can actually figure out, okay, well, if Germany had let's see, 10.6 winners per 1,000, at what point would they have run out of winners? Would they have been limited in the draw? And the answer is obviously no. There's 30,000 case numbers in Europe in DV 2019, and I think it's 31,000 or so, and 269 winning cases. So roughly speaking, that's how they distributed the number of German cases throughout the whole number range, right? Roughly about 10 cases. Now, these numbers here are slightly high because they are based on the entries and they don't take into account the number of cases that are rejected for bad photos or for fraudulent entries and so on. Okay, so it's not going to be a precise correlation. It won't exactly tie to the 31,000, but you can pretty reliably say, okay, we can assume that that country was or wasn't limited based on the number of entries that it has and the number of case numbers that region as a whole goes up to, right? So if you followed along so far, and I hope you have, if you followed along so far, we can then start to talk about the UK. And we can say, okay, well, what about the UK? How would that have behaved? So let's just make an assumption here. And this is not really a great assumption to make because we don't know yet the number of selectees. We don't yet know the number of entries and so on. And it's going to be a long time before we get the entry numbers. It hopefully will be pretty soon. We'll get the selectee numbers. So I'm going to have to make some pretty broad assumptions here, but it's really just to help the illustration, right? So let's assume that the entry numbers from DV19 were simply repeated in DV26, that we have something like 4.35 million entries, and somehow the UK entries were in that lot. That means that a couple of the countries would have had slightly less and so on. But just follow along here. It's just for mathematical, explanation, right? Now, if we then put into this same chart and we say, okay, how many entries were likely to have come from the UK, right? Let's say, okay, would it have been like Germany, 45,000? No, it seems a bit much because 45,000, there's at least one pretty good agent in Germany, usdreams.de, I think is their website. They're a good, reputable agent, and they are helping people doing entries mainly from Germany, but also other countries in Europe, right? And all over the world, perhaps. I'm not sure. But the number of entries from Germany is fairly high. The number of entries from France is 34,000, seems a bit more reasonable. Maybe it would be closer to that. But also we have to consider, okay, France and Germany have been in the game for many years. More people will generally know about the TV lottery in France and Germany than perhaps in the UK. It was relatively new. This was only the second year where UK cases were allowed to enter, right? So I'm just going to say, I think there's going to be less entries in the UK than France had in DV 2019 for our comparison, and I think that actually there would probably be something like let's say 20,000. If there's 20,000 entries, I think there'd be 20,000 derivatives. We'd have about 40,000 people from the UK, but 20,000 entries is my sort of assumption. If that were the case, and there were 4.35 million entries, then 0.46 or 4.6 cases per thousand is the number of entries we would expect to see in every 1,000 places, right? So if they ran the draw from one, and they included numbers from 1 to 10,000, we would expect to see 10 times 10 1,000 chunks of 4.6 winners for each of those thousands. Again, we're talking about a statistical distribution here, a uniform distribution. It's not going to be exactly correct, but it's just to show you roughly how many there would be. If that were the case, and you had 20,000 entries, and you had 4.3 million entries in total, there would be 4.6 entries in every single 1,000 chunk from 1 to 4.3 million, 4.35 million, right? There would be 4.6 entries per thousand, which means that if they had done what I would have thought would have been the normal job, they would have said, okay, what we need is to apply the cutoff for the UK winners at the same point that we applied the cutoff for the rest of Europe. What do I mean by the cutoff? I should explain that first. So the cutoff comes as saying, okay, once I've ordered all of those numbers from 1 to 4.35 million, every single case has got a number, right? I'm then going to say, how many of those cases do I want to select as being my winners before I start weeding out false entries, bad photos, all of that sort of stuff, right? And arbitrarily, kind of, the government say, okay, we'll take the first 50,000 numbers, or the first 48,000 numbers, or the first 25,000 numbers, whatever they want to take. And there has been some years where they've taken, let's say, 20 or 25,000 numbers, and then they've added to that in a second part of their process, either before the May results are announced, or in some years they can even do that as part of what we call a second draw in September or October of that year. They can add extra winners. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that's going to happen now. That would be absolutely ludicrous to do that at this point, for reasons that should be clear to you by now. But you can see the principle, right? So they arbitrarily say, okay, the first 50,000 winners are going to be the winners for Europe. And they ran the draw on that basis, but they had hidden the UK winners from that first 50,000, right? So then I come along with my lawsuit and point out that they've screwed up. The government doesn't really want to admit that to me, apparently. But they take the point and they go and run the draw process for the UK winners. But instead of stopping the draw process at 50,000 to match with the rest of Europe, they continue the draw process inexplicably until 200,000, let's say. Now, I don't know that number precisely, but I'm going to assume it's about 200,000, where they then switched off the selection process and said, oh, that'll be enough winners then, right? Now, in that case, in the scenario that I've created here, we would have 4.6 winners per 1,000 for 200 single chunks. So we would have 200. What would we have? We would have, if this was the case, and I'm just making this up, right? We would have 200 chunks of 4.6 winners. We would have 920 winning cases out of the 20,000 winning cases. That is a ridiculously high winning chance. It's almost 5%. 5% of 20,000 would give us 1,000 cases, right? So, and that is unlike any other country in Europe. And the reason that we've got such a high winning chance for the UK is not because there are more winning chances for those individual cases. It's that they've made the number range greater than the other number range for Europe. So Europe goes from 1 to 50,000, but the UK goes from 1 to 200,000. So we've got a lot more winning cases, right? Because the distribution is going to be the same either way, right? Now, in that scenario, they would be publishing and again, I'm making these numbers up. I don't know if this is true at all, right? But in the scenario where there was 20,000 derivatives on the 20,000 cases, then they would publish a number saying there are 1,840 winning selectees in the UK, right? Which would be completely overstated, right? Not realistic at all. But that's what they would say, because they've selected all these people and they've informed those people now that they're winning cases. However, if your case number is higher than the rest of Europe, your chance of getting current is extremely low, because there is not going to be a fix to these numbers. It does not make sense to take case number 150,000 and to reassign it with a lower case number. It doesn't make any sense to do that, right? Because your chance of selection was really to do with the order in which you were jumbled up in the 4.3 million entries. And the question is simply whether they've informed people up to 50,000 or up to 200,000, as they actually did for the UK, right? It's nothing to do with increasing your chance of selection. It's nothing to do with, in terms of getting more entries per 1,000. It's nothing to do with that. The numbers were assigned wherever they were assigned. Okay, we knew that from the DV25 case as well. People were given numbers, it looked to some people it might have looked random, but it didn't look random to me. There was logic with the numbers that were assigned, right? And so there is logic with this process too for DV26. It's just the stupidity has been applied by saying, okay, let's inform everyone up to 200,000. That's the stupid part. So, but the numbers and your position within that 1 to 200,000 group, that's accurate. That's always been accurate. And so if you're case number 150,000, you were case number 150,000 out of 4.35 million entries in my assumption, right? I'm assuming that there were 4.35 million entries. There may not have been 4.35 million. It might have been 3 million. It might have been 5 million. I don't know. But your position, if you're case number 150,000, your position is 150,000 out of all of those entries, right? So I'm hoping that's making a bit more sense to you, and it sort of sounds a bit more reasonable and logical, right? So the sort of questions I'm getting is, will they fix this? No, they won't fix this, because it would not be fair. It wouldn't even be legal to take a number, case number 150,000, and somehow reassign it to case number 10,000, right, or 20,000 or whatever. They won't fix it in that way. That's not, I mean, if they did, we'd have to sue them again, because frankly, that would not be fair to anybody else, right? And my, my job, if you want to call it a job, nobody's paying me to do this job, but my, interest is in making sure that we've got a fairly run process, that we have a correctly run process. I'm not trying to make things better for UK entries than it should have been. I'm trying to make it the same for UK entries as it should have been. I'm trying to get it to be fair and correct, not more advantageous for UK entries, right? So that's one aspect of it. Now, the other thing is, okay, how on earth are you ever going to get current if your case number 150,000? Well, the simple answer is you're probably not going to be. The first 50,000 entries is probably too many entries for Europe as a whole, with the number of visas that are available for Europe as a whole, right? There are around about 19,000 visas available for Europe in DV 2026, roughly speaking. And there will be way more than 19,000 people selected in Europe under 50,000. Right, including some of those cases being UK cases, right? And so this is the hard part. This is the tough thing to explain. In most years, there's usually a cutoff number which is limiting the number of people who can go current. Last year, there were case numbers up to 41,000. But they cut off the visa bulletin number at 23,000 in Europe. Now, 23,000 was too low, no doubt about that, and that meant that they've actually wasted thousands of visas in DV 2025. But still, they have a right to do that. If they choose to do that, they can do that. They don't have to use every single visa. Okay. So in DV 2025, they cut the number off at 23,000. In DV 2024, there were case numbers up to, I think, 56,000, and they actually went current to 50,000, right? However, if we go back, let me just show you again. If we go back and we look at the data for DV 2025, let me have a look at that. Yes. There's the 23,000 cutoff, right? That's you can see that. That makes sense to you, I'm sure. If we look at DV24, though, you'll see an interesting thing. Let me just switch on the EU numbers. Right. So 50,000 is where the numbers went current to. But if you look very carefully at this data, you'll see that whereas out of this first 1,000 cases, 55,000 or so, 55% or so were real cases, 65% or so were holes. And then you can see that the green and the red is cases that were actually interviewed. And there was a high percentage of the real cases that were interviewed. that percentage drops off throughout the number range, right? Because lower case numbers get more chance of being interviewed by more of the embassies. Some of the embassies don't go to the highest case numbers. But by the time we got to about 35, 36, 37,000, the percentage chance of being interviewed drops dramatically, because quite frankly, the jump that happened in the last month moved from 30,000 in DV24 to 50,000 in DV24, and that was completely unjustified by embassy capacity. There was not enough capacity in all of the embassies that could see people for them to go and arrange interviews for all of these cases that KCC had suddenly made current, or the visa office had made current, up to 50,000. So you can see that, for example, by the time you get to case number 40,000, between 40,000 and 50,000, there were 2,400 cases, real live cases, and only 47 of those cases got scheduled for interview. That's a pathetic performance, but it was entirely predictable because embassies didn't have the capacity to interview all those people, right? They go in number order, and capacity just ran out before that. So they could have stopped the numbers at about 35,000 or so, roughly, in DV24, but they chose to make it current until 50,000. And so whilst the 50,000 number may give you some comfort for DV 2026, it probably shouldn't give you much comfort because it was an unrealistic number. Okay. So what's likely to happen in DV26, and when can we start sort of understanding and making predictions? Well, it's going to be very confusing this year to try and make any predictions because there's a lot going on. We have the government have implemented travel bans that affects a lot of people in Africa and Asia. It's very impactful to Asia, somewhat impactful to Africa. In that scenario, those people that are impacted by a travel ban, if the travel ban stays in place, which we don't know, right, that will mean that some people in some countries, and could be about 30,000 people, won't be able to process their cases in Africa or Asia regions, right? Wherever those people live. It's not because of where they live, it's to do with the country they come from. So this is Trump's travel ban. He has just arbitrarily decided that people from country A, country B, country C shouldn't be able to enter the country, and that affects the winners in the DV lottery as well. And so it will ruin the chances while the travel ban is in place. Now, Trump could wake up tomorrow and remove the travel ban, or he could leave it in place for the whole of DV26. I have no idea what he's going to do. I don't think he knows what he's going to do. But he implemented the ban, and he wanted to block people. I don't think he's suddenly going to turn into Mr. Nice Guy and remove the ban. I think we might be stuck with the ban for quite some time. Why is that important for the UK and for Europe as a whole? Well, there is a rule that says unused visas from one region can be used by the other regions in a certain distribution manner. It's part of the law that establishes DV lottery. And so in the scenario where Africa, which is the biggest recipient of visas, it's got the highest quota, and Asia, which has got the third highest quota of visas, in the situation where those two regions can't use all of their visas, then Europe is the next biggest region that could gain the most visas from the unused visas pot, right? And so there's a chance, therefore, that those visas, if the travel ban stays in place, which would be, to be honest, I'm not wishing for this at all because it's horrific to implement this travel ban and stop people from various countries being able to process their DV lottery win. I consider it horrific. But to be pragmatic about the discussion of this, if that travel ban stays in place, then it will be advantageous to people from Europe with high case numbers, right? And also to non-banned countries in Asia with high case numbers, and also non-banned countries, people from non-banned countries in Africa with high case numbers, and so on, right? But the region that is best placed, you might say, to sort of swoop in and use those unused visas is Europe. Europe has a high number of derivatives per case. It has a high percentage chance of approval, higher than Africa. It gets high number of people turning up for interviews and so on. And so Europe is very well placed to grab many of those visas that are being unused by other regions. So in that scenario, it could give some help to Europe. Now, having said all of that and explained all of that about the redistribution of visa allocation and quota, and also about the travel ban, etc., this is all painted against a picture where we don't even know how many selectees we have yet for each of the regions and each of the countries and so on. So I don't even know for a fact yet that we have too many selectees in DV2026. But I'm making that assumption simply because of the case numbers that we were already hearing about. It's difficult to imagine how we can have case numbers up to 50,000 without having something like 20,000 real cases in that group. And if we've got 20,000 real cases in Europe under 50,000, then we have about 40,000 selectees, and there are only 19,000 visas available through the quota as the formula states, right? So it seems highly likely that we will have at least 20,000 winning cases in Europe. In my opinion, that would give us that would be a holds rate of 60%, which is the highest holds rate I can imagine could possibly happen. I don't think it's actually going to be as high as that. I wouldn't be at all surprised if we actually see more like 25,000 winning cases and more like 50,000 selectees. And again, all of this is excluding UK. The UK is is in addition to this. And then we'll have some number of UK winners as well under that 50,000 number. And those UK cases are going to be made current at the same rate as the other European cases, right? So, so we've got to hear what those numbers, what they're like. And once we hear the numbers, we can then do the calculations and say, okay, how many cases from Iran are there in Asia? How many cases from Afghanistan? How many cases from Yemen? And those three countries I just mentioned, they're all travel banned right now. So, how many of the Asian cases are not able to proceed, right? How many of the African cases are not able to proceed? What's the impact of the ban? There's also other impacts going on. I mean, when there are countries that have high numbers of selectees but tend to have low numbers of approved cases, it tends to be because economically those countries are challenged, or there's perhaps civil war going on, or some sort of war or disturbance going on in the area. And so those things happen too, right? But they're more localized and more unique to individual countries and regions. So I'm in talking about the travel ban, that's a fairly big sort of global factor that will be in place, or potentially will be in place depending on what Trump does next. So hope it's all making sense in terms of the explanation of how the draw works and some of the assumptions I've made just for illustration purposes. And we'll find out later how many selectees we've got, and we'll be able to sort of do some sort of math to say, okay, there are these many selectees. But the main thing you should take away from this is that whatever case number you've got in UK, your case number was the correct case number. They didn't do a second draw. They didn't do some sort of second process, etc. There isn't something special that happened to the UK other than revealing too many winners up to 200,000 rather than stopping at about 50,000 like the rest of EU. That's the only mistake they've made. And it's a horrific mistake to have made, because it's telling a lot of you that you're going to get a chance to interview. And unless the region goes current, which is kind of unlikely, then that isn't going to happen. There's probably going to be a cutoff number in place at the end of the year. And the only way there wouldn't be a cutoff number in place at the end of the year is if there's too few selectees, fewer than I expect, or there's very big impact from the travel ban and there's more sort of consumption of unused visas from the other regions by Europe. And that somehow is allowed to just continue during the year, as opposed to just leaving it all to the last month. If they leave it all to the last month, then that isn't going to happen either. That redistribution of visas thing tends to happen towards the last couple of months of the year. But by that time, there's also a capacity concern with the embassies. So it's not necessarily the free lunch, it sounds like, because the embassies by that time can't take a sudden huge swelling of the number of people scheduled for interview. Okay, so wow, this is a this is a 55-minute long video, I just noticed. If you got through all this video and you understand more, I'm happy. But also applause to you for sticking with it for 55 minutes. And I know some of you hopefully will have put my voice on 1.5 times speed or something. But anyway, this has been a fairly thorough explanation of what went on, and I'm hoping therefore it will be useful to some of you who've got questions. All right, everybody. Please do stay with me for the year, even if your case number 150,000 in the UK or something like that. Stay with me for the year because you just don't know what's going to happen. This is a mysterious process at times. Weird things tend to happen in this process. And although I'm fairly, pessimistic about your chances if you've got case numbers over 50,000, and possibly pessimistic about case numbers of even lower than that, even though that's how I feel right now, I don't know everything, and I don't know what's going to happen in the next 12 months. That hasn't happened yet, right? And so who knows what's going to happen, right? I mean, weird things tend to happen. And if there's another big factor that comes along, goodness forbid, something like a COVID again, if we had some sort of other big crisis that meant a lot of people couldn't process their cases or suddenly didn't want to process their cases, civil war in America, for example, comes to mind. If something like that happens, then a lot of people might start not turning up for their interviews, not submitting their DS260s, and a lot of people, would therefore get a chance at higher case numbers than would otherwise have happened. So stick with me for the year if you're DV26 selectee, even though it might seem hopeless at the moment. I suggest you subscribe to my channel. That would help me and help you. And if this video has been useful to you, give me a thumbs up on it, please. That would be greatly appreciated too. All right, everybody, have a good day. Bye-bye.